This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sirr.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show. Well, 2022 has been an absolutely brilliant year for books, and Peter and I have thoroughly enjoyed having writers and poets on Books for Breakfast to talk about their new books. We've had Wendy Erskine, we've had Colm Tóibín, Eiléan, Gabriel Byrne, to name just a few. But for our final podcast of the year today, New Year's Eve, before 2023 is rung in, we thought we'd have a chat about books that we're reading at the moment that we're really enjoying, as well as presenting some of the Books for Breakfast highlights of 2022 as well. So, Peter, voracious reader that you are, what books are you reading at the moment? What have you got on the table for us?
Well, as always, I have a big and unruly pile as I'm pretty unsystematic and disorganised as a reader. And I'm also a regular visitor to second-hand bookshops, and I kind of like to have a certain amount of my reading directed, if you like, by the serendipity of whatever I happen on or am pulled towards, because it's a weird thing, but I don't believe it's ever quite random what happens in a second-hand bookshop. I mean, it's almost as if they find you out in a way. They kind of lead you towards some of your deepest interests, I think. So at the moment, I'm immersed in a book I found in the last bookshop in Camden Street, and if anybody's in that area, I strongly recommend it. It's called the book is called The Horse, the Wheel and Language: How Bronze Age Writers from the Eurasian Steppes Shaped the Modern World, and it's by David Anthony. It was published by Princeton University Press in 2007. And what it is essentially a history of Indo-European. So it's like the idea that the original Indo-European language, Proto-Indo-European, from a lot of our languages come, like English and German and Irish and Italian and Sanskrit and so on, come from the area that's now occupied by the Ukraine. And like, thanks to the invention of the wheel all those thousands of years ago, populations migrated from that area. And, so the result of that is that nearly half the world's language derived from that original Proto-Indo-European. So the book explores that process. And if you're like me and you're kind of obsessed with language and their origins, then it's certainly the book for you. So I kind of would recommend that.
Sounds great, Peter. Now, the other book you've been reading is sort of related in a way, isn't it? Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, that's right. The other thing I'm reading at the moment is Winters in the World, A Journey Through the Anglo-Saxon Year. And it's by Eleanor Parker, and it came out this year. And the book takes us through the various the various festivals, customs and traditions linked to the seasons. But what I find particularly interesting is how she draws on the poetry to show us the inner world of the Anglo-Saxons. And I've been particularly taken by the importance of winter in the Anglo-Saxon imagination, a place of dark, cold and fear, but also of the comfort of the mead hall, feasting and stories, and Beowulf listening to the tragic story of the feud between the Frisians and the Danes, or lines like these on winter. Snow bounds the earth in winter tumults, the skies grow cold with hard hail showers and ice and frost. Hoary battle marchers locked up the homeland of men, the dwellings of the people. The lands were frozen with cold and chilly icicles. The force of the waters was shrunken. Across the river currents, ice builds a bridge, a dark sea road.
My God, Peter, it sounds like some of the weather we've been having here. But it also brings me back to winter poems. I always turn to them at this time of the year. I know you do as well, Peter, because I think for poets, wintertime, just before the solstice, is a very imaginative time of turning inwards and finding that the darkness can often be as interesting as the light. And a poem that I love is this one by Wendell Berry, To Know the Dark, which wisely says that the darkness too can bloom and sing. And I'm going to treat you to it now, Peter. It goes like this. To go in the dark with a light is to know the light. To know the dark, go dark, go without sight, and find that the dark too blooms and sings and is travelled by dark feet and dark wings.
And speaking of poetry, I see you have a book there of poetry that I know you've been reading.
Yes, this is a book published by Wake Forest Press in the States. You can see it here, Peter. It's by Katrina Clutterbuck. She teaches Irish literature at UCD, but she's also had poetry published in lots of journals and publications, including Poetry Ireland Review, Crannog, Staying Human, New Poems for Staying Alive by Blood Express and edited by Neil Astley, and lots of other anthologies and journals. But her book of poems that I'm holding here, called The Magpie and the Child, It's, as Bernard O'Donoghue said, it's a masterpiece of sentiment and understanding. And the emotional core of it is the death of her 11-year-old daughter, Emily, from an unsuspected heart condition in 2013. And this book it's powerful. It really moved me. It's filled with memories, with recollections, with conversations with both the living and the dead child. And the second half of the book, it forms a kind of fragmented diary with really memorable and poignant recollections. And Katrina Clutterbuck, she grew up in a farming family in County Tipperary, and she lives close to there now. And one of these diary sections has her returning to her house from Dublin, and it's the evening of the summer solstice. And in this poem, she's remembering her early days of marriage and her daughter. And I think great poetry is often a moment delicately caught, and here, I think, is one such moment.
Would you like to read it, Enda?
I would, yeah. I step out of the car from Dublin and make my way up the field in the last light of the summer solstice, keeping a wary eye on the black sheep lying in against the ditch for the night, unused now to our arrivals, and among which is a young ram. At the highest point I crouch to the grass. Once before, he and I raced from the city to make it to this spot at this hour, stood together in our first year of marriage, and gloried in the gold expanse of the whole world at our feet, our only daughter still to be conceived, along with the 11 years thereafter we would be given to keep her. He cannot be with me tonight, but I have come to mark this for us both. Even though there is no slow drop of a pure and unimpeded ball of light behind the devil's bit, extending our day beyond anything that could have seemed possible. This time, the whole evening sky must be its own imaginary rainbow, arcing colourless and wide and mottled as the breeze, scoring at dogs' faraway bark and our neighbours' near-grown lambs calling. Hunkered low, my face is touched by full seed heads. I see more flowers than we ever imagined surviving here, with the trees on our boundary ditch so greenly made up with themselves that it's hard to believe that from tonight they start to throw it all away again. Our cat comes calling pitifully to me for his dinner. All my care. I make one wish to go well till winter and stand up aching to lead him home, passing by the baby horse chestnut tree we bought for £5 one summer fete and proudly planted by her in our garden, nearly as tall now as she would be, within its own tightly lawn-moored circle of sleeping dog daisies and buttercups and clover. So that was a really beautiful poem, wasn't it, Peter? But I know you've got more books there on the table too, haven't you?
Yeah, I've got some poetry, but before that I have a novel actually by a poet, Stretto by David Wheatley, which came out from CB Editions this year. And it describes itself as both a story of travel and migration, moving between Ireland, England and Scotland over a 20-year period, and an exploration of the nature of self and reality. So it kind of plots its way from the original the east coast of Ireland, where the narrator starts out, to the east of England, and kind of back and forth between these two places and other places as well. And I suppose in a way it's kind of a disguised autobiography, and it follows very much the pattern of David Wheatley's own life. But it's kind of more interested in the possibilities of the musical technique which gives the book its title. Stretto is a fugue technique where the melody, the subject, is repeated in another voice, but before the statement of the original subject has finished. So it organises a series of very short chapters, kind of riffs almost, a riff on rubbish and dumping, or a riff on Scottish identity, or Eliot's dismissal of Scottish literature as incoherent provincialism, or MacDiarmid describing Glaswegian as the language of the gutter, or the writer's own identity. I've often wondered what language it is I speak, or a Nigerian woman speaking Irish and getting abused for it, or the unnamed figure of Philip Larkin kind of wandering around what would seem to be Hull and thinking about the narrative, thinking about the nature of poetry. Poems are not spoken by actual people. They do not have paraphrasable things to say or attitudes as such. So, there's observations on Bach or Schoenberg or Ligeti. So kind of that's very much how the book proceeds, as a series of kind of like discrete observations, intense meditations, very often very much kind of focused on comings and goings and landscape and origin and occupation.
And it's a book which gives readers a lot of freedom, I think, Peter, isn't it? Because you don't necessarily have to read it from kind of the beginning to the end.
I mean, it's very much a book that you can dip into. You're not kind of following the arc of a plot. It's not, it's nominally, I suppose, a novel, but in effect, it's a series of mini essays, and nothing wrong with that. And it can be very funny as well. I mean, one of my favorite ones is number 56, and he's kind of trying to describe his novel as if it was a piece of university research, and he's trying to put together the research output title, Research Environment Commentary. The impetus for this research output attached came from a preliminary discussion with my line manager in light of my recent work on Diagnosis 4, Protected Term, and their proposal that in light of our existing strengths in the field, having first secured funding and benchmarking the project outcomes against, I should then something, and he says, I chose the title Strata for reasons of, I liked it, my research practice has involved sitting at a kitchen table. Rephrase. Often the writing process has resembled nothing so much as a slot machine. You put something in and something might come out or not. Since developing these research interests, having long carried around these random obsessions, I've aspired to give them a more developed form. Or I have played in the park with a toddler this morning and noted down what they said for writing up later. Questions are raised of the social prestige enjoyed by different forms of research. Things you write on your hand, and so on. So it's kind of, that's exactly what it is. I mean, it's a set of seemingly kind of random observations, things that have occurred and that are written up later, and nothing wrong with that. I mean, I do agree with what Kirsty Gunn has said about it on the back, that each section is a bar of poetry, both fitted within and overlaying the prose that describes it. Each page and a half is measured to sing out exactly in the key and time signature to which it has been set.
Sounds brilliant, Peter. Congratulations to David Wheatley. That was his new novel published in 2022 called Stretto, and it came from CB Editions. Well, I just listening to you earlier, Peter, you were talking about do books choose you in bookshops. I love that idea that you don't actually randomly just come upon a new writer, that book is actually seeking you out as a reader. And I think maybe that's what happened to me with this next book that I have here. You can see it in front of me, Peter. It's a novel called My Phantoms, and it's by Gwendolyn Riley. Maybe many listeners out there have read her and they're going, oh, I love Gwendolyn Riley. Well, I never had read her, so it was amazing to discover her. It's I really think, such an acutely observed book about family relations, and in particular a relationship between a young woman called Bridget and her mother Helen, or Hen as she's called, and the mother's lonely life. She's had 2 failed and awful marriages, and her daughter Bridget, or Bridge, meets her every January, mostly in the Troubadour, for her mother's birthday, and she hears about her mother's failed efforts to find a new man, her frantic joining of new clubs, her constantly wanting to join in, but at the same time she always wants to stand apart. And always throughout the novel we're getting the fractious relationship between the mother and the daughter, and it's brilliantly revealed, the cruelties that they both inflict on each other, and essentially the mystery that they both are to each other. I mean, we can know people throughout our lives and they still remain a mystery to us. And I thought that Gwendolyn Riley, she really has razor sharp observations that can often be funny, startlingly accurate on dialogue. And I think this novel is, as Monica Ali said, it's achingly sad, it's subversively funny. I found it brilliant, I found it bleak, and I'm really looking forward to reading more of her books. So that was a brilliant book to find, My Phantoms by Gwendolyn Riley.
And it's published by Granta. And just to say, if anybody's interested, she's the author of 6 novels, including First Love, which won the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize, was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, the Dylan Thomas Prize, Goldsmiths Prize, and many others.
Yes, she really is one of the greats writing at the moment, I think, Gwendolyn Riley. But moving on, I see a book in front of me here, Peter, that you've been enjoying. It's by Louis Dupuer, the poet. So would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, it's Crooked Love, or Grá Fear, a bilingual collection of Louis' poems published by Blood Axe this year in association with Clo Iar Chonacht. And it's mainly drawn from two previous collections. And the translations are, as I said, it's a bilingual anthology. So the translations are by Kevin Anderson, Biddy Jenkinson, and Louis himself. And for me, one of the pleasures of the book is the stereophonic experience of the original and the translation complementing each other. And there's lots of, there's lots of striking poems in the book. I mean, it's a hefty, you're talking about 150 pages of poems. But, just to take some examples, there's a great poem called Luck. It's like an account of a subway ride in New York where a man is being chased by cops as the poet rides the subway. And so he's kind of like, Tapolinianish gach tíomhdín gunny ama, see the gold through them goroshta hokyun. So it's like cops are everywhere, guns cocked, moving through the carriage, silent as their target. And all this is happening. As all this is happening, the poet concentrates with all his might on a poem, like one of these poems on the underground or poems on the dart, but there's a poem by Langston Hughes above the carriage of the subway door that he's standing beside. So he's looking up and he sees, sometimes a crumb falls from the tables of joy. And this poem by Langston Hughes gets kind of stitched into his poem very much as well, so that sometimes a crumb falls from the tables of joy, sometimes a bone is flung, to some people love is given, to others only heaven. But there's a lot of other things. I mean, there's a lot of other kind of moments in the book. There's a very fine, moving love poem called Multitasking. It has the same title in Irish and English. And in the opening poem, there's a very interesting kind of what he calls a slant translation of Billy Collins's poem for the first generation of people to exist after the death of the English language, except that Louis Dupuis is imagining the death of Irish rather than English. So I'll just give you a little kind of blast of that. This is the opening of the book. Don Gid Ruin a Waditrish Vos na Gaeilge, for the first generation to survive the death of Irish. Ní fiú mór an dua chahalis an dánseo, ní betosa abalta é lev peisgele, is tá nithe haris sin mar imagine. Mar hampla don rééis unta slacht for a scríb dóis an gur féidir lo fós gailga a hiiscint. This poem is hardly worth trouble. It isn't as though you'll be able to read it. And I have other things on my mind this morning. For instance, writing a half-decent poem in Irish for those who still get it. Who'd have thought they'd find a place for her in the burial ground of the dumb? I used to imagine her laying flowers at the tombs of her ancestors, Latin, French, Scandic, English. But nowadays, you lot get to visit her family plot of a Sunday afternoon, provided, of course, you still get weekends in what's left to you of a world. So that's how the book starts. But at the heart of the book is a sequence of poems. It's called Ládárá, or One Day, and it's a day in the life of an imaginary village somewhere in the west of Ireland, where the kind of living and the dead encounter each other, and real and unreal are mixed up together. It was actually produced by Rockfinch, the production company, Claire Cunningham's production company that did the poetry programme until very recently, and it was done as a dual language broadcast on Lyric FM this year with music by Diana Lynn. And this is an excerpt from it now called The Unshapeale Full of, or The Empty Church. And also, before I play this, we've posted links to the whole piece for anyone who wants to listen to it. And I would recommend that. So here it is then, Unshapeale Full of, The Empty Church.
Sa sépéal ciúin leis den as, tá lánúin óg ón muilin gear I siúl fasáiste cail an áthis, den giadúir ó lá na bainise. In the empty church by the waterfall, a young couple from Mullingar walked the narrow aisle of happiness for the first time since the wedding. Their eyes have grown accustomed to the semi-dark as they approach in their denim jeans the altar where the perpetual light of hope still flickers. The scent of rhododendrons blows through a small hole in the stained glass of their memory, and the bride is having trouble lighting her white candle at the railings. All around, the air is on fire, and her hand shakes as it did that day the future placed its old gold ring on her finger. Her husband catches her moist hand, and the hot tears of the candle scald his soft skin. The rhododendrons breathe a fragrant sigh. They can't wait for another wedding to go to in their lovely purple dresses.
Oh, that was beautiful. I really love Louis Dupuer's work. And that was Peter talking about Crooked Love, or Gros Fear, a bilingual collection of Louis Dupuer's poems published by Blood Axe in association with Cló Iar Connacht. And it's mainly, as Peter said, drawn from 2 previous collections. But it was wonderful to hear Louis there and to hear you talking about his work, Peter.
We're drawing close to the end of this section now, but I know, Wendy, you've got a couple more books that you'd like to squeeze in.
I certainly would like to get just 2 more, if I could, before the New Year bells ring out. And one of the books is called Mrs. Bridge, and it was written by Evan S. Connell. It's published as a Penguin modern classic, and as it says on the cover, a perfect novel, economical, beautiful, true. And I absolutely think that it is that. It was first published in 1959 and it was followed by Mr. Bridge in 1969. It's a novel of huge economy. It's written in, we were talking earlier about David Wheatley's novel Stretto, but this book is written in short vignettes too. There's actually 117 of them. And these vignettes masterfully follow Mrs. Bridge's life, and they trace her unfulfilled life of marriage, neighbours, the country club, her children. And ultimately, I suppose we see a woman that's not really rooted in her world at all, even though it's a world of comfort. She is herself not very comfortable in it. And both novels, I was interested to see, are made into Merchant Ivory films, and they star Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. But I think that's a great novel. I think it's very, very funny, but it's also very moving and sad. And in a way, it kind of links in it with My Phantoms by Gwendolen Riley as well. So I think there must be a theme going on with my reading patterns these weeks, Peter. But also I'd like to mention Earth's Black Shoot, which is a chapbook by the poet Cian Ferriter. It's beautifully produced by Southward Editions. I really like chapbooks. I think it's a great way of reading poetry. You've got a short amount of poems and you can really get into them, I think. These poems are poems of great breadth and depth. They're tender, they're exact. They have a lightness of touch that I enjoyed too. And I'd like to finish with this short little poem by Cian Ferriter. It's from his chapbook Earth's Black Shoot, and it's called Hem. Evenings when you were not yet back, I'd sit on the makeshift bench in the yard of our first house, where you'd hung a line with room for just one dress, and close my eyes and wait for the breeze to lift your hem against my knees.
Thanks, Anna. And it just leaves me to say thank you to all our listeners to Books for Breakfast over 2022. Have a happy new year. And may 2023 bring a year of great reading joy to you all. So goodbye. And in the meantime, we leave you with a selection of voices from this year's Books for Breakfast. Hope you enjoy it.
Well, I was walking down the corridor to my wardrobe of a dressing room, and I saw this, it seemed to me at the time, an elderly man come out in a dressing gown. And as he came nearer, I thought to myself, oh my God, that's Olivier. Because it was a film in which Olivier, Richardson, Gielgud and Byrne and Vanessa Redgrave, an amazing cast. And he came down the corridor and I thought, oh my God. Like in just a flash, I saw Heathcliff and Henry V and, all the amazing characters that he played. And I was utterly, starstruck. And I thought, I better say something. And so I said, do you have the time? Do you have the time or something? And he said, in a very kind of grumpy way, are they paying you for this engagement? I think he said. And I said, yes. And he said, then I suggest you buy yourself a watch. And I thought afterwards, did he mean this humorously, or was he just grumpy as he looked? But a few weeks later, he left this message in my dressing room in his beautiful copperplate black ink, in which he said, I apologize for being brusque, but I was trying to learn lines. And he said, your question has a resonance for me. Do you have the time? He said, because it's something I'm thinking about all the time. I'm thinking about it, because he must have been in his mid-70s coming up that time. Of course, he was thinking about time and mortality and so forth. And he left the Shakespeare sonnet he said, Shakespeare can say it much better than I can. I just thought it was from what seemed like an inconsequential moment. I've never forgotten it. And now, of course, I'm the one thinking about time.
October 5th, 1995. It was lunchtime in the library when Stephen O'Brien, who ran down from the reference library in excitement, said, "Did you hear about Heaney?" I couldn't believe the news. I phoned home to check with Catherine, but she was out. I found our neighbour, Nora Stack, Paul Durkin's cousin from County Mayo, but she hadn't been listening to the radio. I went downstairs to the lending section to look at his books. Sure enough, we had Death of a Naturalist, North, Seeing Things, Station Island and Wintering Out on the shelves. I placed them all on a display shelf after Bernard Cotter from the Torytop Road Library phoned to confirm the brilliant news. I phoned Pat Cotter at Waterstones. He was as jubilant as myself and as disbelieving. "Are you sure? Are you sure?" "Yes, Jesus." The first person I could share the news with at the front desk was Eamon Corcoran, the old Republican activist who walked into the library at 2:15. "Did you hear about Heaney?" "Dear God, not another dead poet. So soon after Sean Dunn." No, it's Heaney. Heaney, he's won the Nobel Prize." Eamon was stunned. Tears of Irish Republican pride welled up in his eyes and began to roll down his cheeks. He took off his trilby and bowed to me in admiration of all poets. "It's a great day for Ireland," he said, filled with emotion. "A great day. God bless them Swedes." I was overcome and began to cry with Eamon. Library customers looked on in pity. We didn't care. It was a great day for Ireland. It was a joy to be alive on such a day. Thank God we'd lived long enough to see this happen 70 years after Yeats's Nobel.
Yeah, because sometimes people said, which one of the people would be most close to you in the stories? And I thought, well, I'll just say, well, actually, the person that is mentioned, who is called Wendy, that is in fact me. But yes, so memento mori. I suppose then there's a couple of things that kind of, normally with me, it's kind of there's not always just one catalyst for a story. There might be like a few, might be an impetus here, an impetus there, and they kind of all kind of come together, sort of concatenation of things. But one of the things was those sorts of, the roadside memorials to people who have passed away. And I remember just seeing one of those outside somebody's house and thinking, I wonder how the people inside feel about that, that is a constant reminder. It is literally a memento mori. It is outside their house, and it's a reminder of death. And they're the ones that are seeing that every single day, even though that isn't their loved one. And so I started thinking about that whole idea, and how some deaths count more than others, how some deaths are mediated to us, magazines, whatever, TV, online, and how others pass away absolutely unnoticed. And that was what started me thinking about that as a story. And I also had wanted to write a story about, sometimes as well, what comes to me is just like a very vivid visual picture. And I just had thought about two women, on a Sunday afternoon, reading the problem page of the Sunday supplement to each other. And that was just something that came to me, just like a little vignette, I suppose. And those two things then worked their way together to make up this story. I always think about the metaphor I always use is like, Penny Falls in the amusements. And like putting in pennies, you're putting in pennies, you're putting in pennies. And whatever happens is sometimes you'll just get a kind of a sequence which will then cause that chain, to all the pennies to drop down the chute. And that's kind of like the way it works with the story. You'll just have a couple of different things that some will work together to form an idea. So that was that.
Seamus had a very good joke, which he told at readings before he would read this poem, that he went to Wexford and he was driving around, I think in his Volkswagen at the time, and he went to Boule-Vogue, but he couldn't quite find it. And he stopped a man and said, I'm looking for Boule-Vogue. And the man looked at him and said, Father Murphy. And the man said, well, now he's not there now. Or he's not there anymore. And Seamus thought this was marvellous. But you see, I suppose the difference is that for a lot of people like Seamus Heaney brought up in the nationalist ballads, it's a symbol, it stands for something. But if you're from Enniscorthy, there's an actual houses called Vinegar Hill Villas. And you could talk about Vinegar Hill, that's where the town reservoir is, so that it has a practical day-to-day presence. But the thing is, no matter what you do sometimes, that summer of 1798, and the fact that the hill was where the place the rebels held, it's become more complicated in recent years as historians have started to work on actually what happened up there in the weeks the rebels held the place. In other words, people were tortured and murdered. But of course, it was a foolish place to hold. They knew nothing about strategy. It wasn't as though they had prepared this rebellion. And to find yourself on top of a hill, with the British forces coming with their cannons, that they can just surround you. And so it was really tragic that they were up there at all. It was the last place they should have been. But there again, it was glorious in some way. It was for later writers. And then there was one exit called Needham's Gap. And so the poem is trying to tease out the whole idea of looking at it as a thing, that it actually is a piece of rock, and what it looks like, because it's from our house, the sun comes up just behind it. So in the morning, it's sort of grayish because the sun is behind it. And then, of course, as the day goes on, you can see it in different ways. So I'm thinking about that as a purely visual experience, what it is like. But then, no matter what you do, the idea of surrender, the idea of being surrounded really comes in and won't go away. So it's a sort of trying to just tease out all that.
What am I?
Leland would have kind of stridently assumed her own identity, not least, I think, because she had a very difficult relationship with her parents. Her mother, in particular, seems to have been very cold, particularly towards Leland, while visiting a lot of love on her sister Paloma. And this seems to have marked out Leland as feeling that there was never quite a fit for her, either at home with her parents, in that society, or indeed in nearly any walk of life where she found herself. There was always a deep yearning to belong, while at the same time pushing back against it and taking nothing less than her own independent standards.
She was very dynamic, but also in some ways very controlled. I met her first the night that Patrick Kavanagh died, and people were falling around the place drunk, and Leland was the most sober person present, and she read a poem in this very precise, ladylike voice, and I thought there was just something so real and alive about her that made me think I wanted to know her better. I went around to see her in her basement flat, which was full of children in various states of... I had no children myself of my own at the time, so it was collapse, I suppose, it was the state. And I saw the other side of her life, which was a bit chaotic, but also something that she was comfortable in, that she she liked Bohemia. She liked other artists. I think it was with them that she felt really accepted.
The bingo bus. In Chuilleanáin there was nothing, but near a town there was the bingo bus. The bingo bus, nearer to thee, my God, the bingo bus, and stripped the willow they played with the driver, trust the conductor, danced turkey in the straw. Every Thursday without fail the ladies rode on the bingo bus. And booze before bingo and after, and lots of booze in between, returning late from bingo, they ate the conductor whole. We in Chuilleanáin wanted oh so much to have a bingo bus of our own. We wrote to the authorities, begged and begged on our knees. TDs were hammered, we marched, made flags, went on hunger strike outside the door. You lot aren't ready for bingo, you've only been here a year. You must have lots more babies before you deserve a bingo bus. So every year to the clinic, 3 out, 1 in, 4 out, 1 in, but still no bingo bus. I had to leave Chuilleanáin, wearied from making flags, marching and lobbying and having kids. So I moved right into a hotel, St. Brendan's is its name. I make sanitary towels for bingo players. I do my bit for bingo players. I'm on the ball for bingo players. I'm saving up for bingo, saving up for bingo.
There's that Clive James line where he says literary criticism may not be vital to literature, but it is vital to civilization. And I think so much of how we think about ideas in the culture and how we think about art is conducted this way. And it's a service performed, for very little pay by people who do it mostly for love. But I think as a service, it's there because we all depend on it. Not just to find out what books we want to read, but to help us think about the books that we have read, or think about the cultural stuff that's going on that we want to talk about. What I had to look at what I had wanted out of life and see that it was kind of a delusion. So I really believed, I think on some fundamental unconscious level, that publishing a novel would solve the problems of my existence. And I think a lot of young writers do believe this, and they. I teach in Trinity, I teach in the creative writing program. I meet a lot of young writers and I tell them this publishing, if you publish this book, it will not solve the problems of your existence. And they go, yeah, okay, sure. And I say, all right, you'll figure it, you'll find out for yourself. But I really did believe it. And the worst, in a way, thing that could have happened was that the book was a success. And to a degree, it looked like I had made absolutely the right choice in life at that point. So I sort of, psychologically, I then sat back and said, well, I've done it now. Was, as I talk about in that piece, was figured out how not to make writing a sort of substitute for living, but how to make it a way of thinking and a way of something that ran alongside and intertwined with my life and was in other words, a job, rather than a sort of all consoling psychological magic bullet, which it definitely is not. It is you can write something and it will help you process the emotions that you write about, and that's absolutely true. But having done that, you still have to get up the next day, and you still have to work and figure out ways to live and yeah. So it really, I went through quite a painful, quite long drawn out process of learning those truths about the world.
I moved to Listowel when I was 11, and my father worked in the bank, so we moved towns quite a bit, and you know that life, Peter, yourself as well. And when I arrived in Listowel, I was a reader. I was a kind of a studious, read a lot of, my mother was a great reader, and my father too. So a lot of books in the house. And when I got to Listowel, there was a great library, and there was a sense that writing was an ordinary activity, and that has always stuck with me. And I think it's really quite unusual. John B. and his son Billy, who is a friend of mine, were just downtown. I'd see Brian McMahon walking around town as well. He was retired as the school principal by that point, but I went to the primary school, so there were just memories of and the actual seeing writers around the place in a very ordinary way. And it wasn't Writers' Week so much as just the fact that writing, like when I was at school, we were all, and again, it's a market town. and Ireland in the 1980s was very depressed economically. The idea of the church, and there was still a very, very kind of grim moral environment around the body and things like that as well. So for a teenager to grow up in that environment, there were lots of things that could be done. And, of course we formed terrible punk bands, but we also tried to write plays and tried to write, and it was there was a lot of ordinary writerly activity going on in the town. And I think that's really shaping, so that I've always tried to think of how poetry is in conversation with the other ordinary activities of modern life. The other thing I think I should say about Listowel is that it's the home of Kerry Co-op. It's a big factory town. It's got this weird stock exchange element in terms of the little bits of wealth which are around the town. So it's really, it's one of like Declan Kybert's thing about modernity in Ireland and the weird modernness of even the fringes of different parts of Ireland. So Listowel felt very much in touch with modernity to me as well. And when I go back there now, as I do every summer, and in between times, if I can, my family are still in the town, and I've lots of friends that I love to see there. And so it's got a great bookshop now in the middle of town as well. So, it's still the town that I knew. It's changed. It's so much more prosperous in many ways. But a lot of the things that were really important and shaped me growing up, the idea that writing mattered, that all of the kind of rage and disappointments and things like that had places to go in art, are still there in the town, I think.
And I wrote this poem when someone very close to me was having heart surgery. And a very good friend of mine who works in cardiac surgery told me, trying to alleviate my fears, that there is no other organ in the human body that we know more about. And I went home and I thought about that. And I thought about what we do and do not know about the human heart. And I wrote this poem. It's called Litany of the Human Heart. This is the heart that can kill us or let us live according to its whims. The heart that knows the word for abandonment in 6,909 different languages, can recite the etymology for the word hunger, turn the 5 stages of grief into 7, while turning every face of heaven toward it like a small sun. It's the broken heart, inventing its own vocabulary from a sleepless night. The heart that makes an anagram for every empty gesture, finds a plastic bag in the street to be a sign, the twisted branch of a tree an omen, the sting of a paper cut a prophecy. The moonstruck, red-eyed pendulum of a heart, the heart that tells you to let go, move on, to go on ahead without it, that it will catch up eventually, but never does. It's a compulsive hoarder of a heart, holding on to everything, like the pajamas of a firstborn still laced with the scent of cornstarch, the sound of a loved one breathing when asleep, a card someone sent for no reason, if only to say, "You are not forgotten," and all the other small, veiled prayers flickering like fireflies under the cupped fingers of night.
I was doing a bit of online research for a sequence of short essays and poems about trees called Notes on Woods. I came across this wonderful term, crown shyness, that applies to certain trees that avoid damaging each other's crowns or catching various kinds of tree-borne infections by growing in such a way as to leave spaces between their own topmost branches and those of adjacent trees. The poem didn't begin as a villanelle. I don't usually work in such confining forms, but by the second draft that pattern of repeated phrases and images suggested itself, so I went along with it. Talking about an even more restrictive form, the sestina, Paul Muldoon likened it to stepping into the dark, because the very strictness of the pattern pushes you in directions you mightn't otherwise have considered exploring. So a poem about trees became, to some extent, a poem about marriage. There is a short, beautifully simple description on Wikipedia which I use as an introduction. Crown shyness, a phenomenon observed in some tree species in which the crowns of fully stalked trees do not touch each other, forming channel-like gaps. Wikipedia. If you want to see the pattern that they've made, you need to look up from the forest floor in summer. Ends of branches don't abrade each other, but leave ripples in their shade, as if they've grown wary of that war that moves inside the pattern that they've made. Mapping the movements of the winds that flayed and thrashed their heads till they became heart-sore, they made room for whatever might abrade. It took time. Now the channels are inlaid, and every shivering tip has taken score, moving in time with the pattern that they've made. Seams in the brainy dark, a bright cascade, a shyness almost human at its core, a canopy of gaps that can't abrade. No matter how many arguments have swayed the trees, the wood, the gap between the door and frame describes the pattern we have made, that only stillness and silence will abrade.
Yes, that was a whole set of silver. My grandmother, who's from my mother's side, was a Dutch suffragette and very intellectually inclined, but she was also a great aesthete, and people would photograph her outfits. I mean, she was very fond of beautiful things. So she bought this whole set of silver, French silver, and when the Nazis confiscated the house they had on the seashore, they stole absolutely everything that was in the house. But they dropped this spoon, and my mother picked it up. I mean, they could have shot her for it. You know, she picked it up and she hid it. And when my daughter Sirr was born, she gave the spoon to me. So she was born with a restolen silver spoon. Yeah.
Where does it hurt? River hidden in the wood, do you mean us harm or good? Cicada, without your song, days are colder, nights long. Why, aspen leaf, do you tremble when there's no wind at all? Your flight, swallow, cannot mend this torn world it seems to mend. O mother, put on the kettle, I am certain of so little. Bell, you strike the hour of 8. We all know it's getting late. Open, beetle, your lovely back. try to show us what we lack. Loving scarf of atmosphere, we pluck your threads, we interfere. Grass, prepare your sharpest blade. They say it's time our debts were paid. Third planet from the sun, what have we done? What have we done?
And that was, in turn, Gabriel Byrne, Thomas McCarthy, Wendy Erskine, Colm Tóibín, Brian Leyden, Eiléan Chuilleanáin, Leland Bardwell, Kevin Power, John McAuliffe, Kelly Michels, Mark Granier, Judith Mock and Mark Roper.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley and I have Peter Sirr here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And yeah, so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.